The bones in the basement of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital had been dissolving in chemicals for so long that identification was nearly impossible. 47 skeletal remains arranged in neat rows, each labeled with a number rather than a name, each a person who had entered the hospital seeking treatment for mental illness and who had instead become part of a collection. The priest who discovered them, Father Marcus Whitmore, the hospital chaplain for 3 years, found himself staring at the meticulous documentation in the hospital director's ledger. Patient admitted July 1911. Patient discharged August 1911. Except the discharge date was actually the date of death, and the basement was actually a crematorium built into the hospital's infrastructure decades before anyone thought to question why such a facility would be necessary for a hospital that officially reported 0 deaths per year. The psychiatric hospital operated for 43 years. 47 bodies were discovered, but the investigation would eventually reveal that these were only the remains that the director had been too careless to fully dispose of. The true number of victims was closer to 200, and the director, a man named Dr. Samuel Ashford, who had been celebrated as a pioneer in psychiatric medicine, had methodically murdered patients for nearly half a century, while the psychiatric establishment applauded his innovative treatments, and his psychiatric peers recommended their most difficult cases be sent to his hospital for his miraculous cures. Before we descend into the basement where those bones were found, before we examine the meticulous records of a killer who had hidden in plain sight as a respected physician, before we confront the question of how the psychiatric establishment failed so completely to notice that patients were disappearing into what should have been a hospital of healing and were never emerging, take a moment to answer these questions in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? And most importantly, are you watching alone, or is someone there with you? Because this story gets darker with each revelation, and you might want someone nearby before the full scope of what happened at St. Augustine's becomes clear. This is a story about institutional horror. This is a story about how monsters can hide inside systems designed to protect the vulnerable. And this is a story about a man who murdered 200 people in a place that was supposed to heal them, and who was celebrated for doing it. The basement of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital smelled like chemicals and time. Father Marcus Whitmore descended the stone stairs slowly, his hand trailing along the damp brick wall, his eyes adjusting to the darkness despite the lamp he carried. The hospital's superintendent, a thin, nervous man named Mr. William Hayes, followed 2 steps behind, his breathing quick and anxious, as if he was afraid of what they might find in the spaces below. It was November 1954. The hospital had been operating for 43 years, built in 1911 on a hillside 40 miles outside Boston, designed to be a sanctuary for the mentally ill, a place where the tormented could find treatment and healing far from the noise and chaos of the city. The building itself was beautiful in an austere way, all gray stone and narrow windows, looking more like a monastery than a hospital, which was perhaps the intention. Dr. Samuel Ashford, the hospital's founder and director, had designed it to be a place of spiritual healing as well as medical treatment. He had wanted the architecture itself to soothe disturbed minds, wanted the patients to feel that they were in a sacred space where recovery was possible. But the basement was something else entirely. The basement was not part of any official architectural drawings. The basement was not mentioned in any administrative documents. The basement was a space that should not exist beneath a healing institution, and yet here it was. A vast underground chamber that extended far deeper than the hospital's foundation, blueprints suggested possible, equipped with facilities that no hospital administrator had ever authorized or inspected. "I don't understand what we're looking for," Hayes said, his voice thin and uncertain. The director said the basement was sealed. He said there was nothing down here but old medical equipment and supplies that had been warehoused decades ago. Marcus did not respond. He was looking at the shelves that lined the walls. Shelves that held glass jars that contained human remains in various states of preservation. Some skeletal, some still bearing traces of tissue, some dissolving into nothing more than pale shadows in chemical solution. The jars were labeled with dates and numbers. July 1911. Patient 1. August 1911. Patient 1. Discharged. But discharged in death, it seemed. Discharged into dissolution in chemicals whose composition Marcus could not identify, but which smelled like a corruption of the hospital's promise to heal. "We need to count them," Marcus said quietly. We need to count how many there are. It took hours. The basement was larger than the entire hospital above, and the shelves extended back into darkness that even the lamp could not fully penetrate. By the time Marcus had moved through the entire chamber, by the time he had documented each jar, each label, each impossible arrangement of human remains, he had counted 47 separate collections. 47 jars. 47 patients whose files showed they had been admitted and then discharged on specific dates. 47 people who had entered St. Augustine's seeking healing, and who had instead become chemistry problems. Their bodies dissolved into the solution that the hospital had apparently kept for this specific purpose. Marcus sat on the stone floor of that basement and understood, with the clarity that comes from absolute horror, that he had been complicit. He had worked at St. Augustine's for 3 years as the hospital chaplain. He had administered last rites and spiritual counsel. He had moved through the halls speaking to patients, listening to their troubles, offering them the comfort of faith. And all the while, beneath his feet, beneath the beautiful gray stone that the doctor had designed to be a sanctuary, 47 people had been dissolving in jars. When he finally climbed the basement stairs and emerged into the hospital's ground level, when he found Dr. Samuel Ashford in his office reviewing patient charts as if it were an ordinary Thursday in 1954, Marcus experienced a moment of dissociation. The doctor looked exactly as he always looked, silver-haired, distinguished, the kind of man whose presence conveyed authority and trustworthiness, the kind of man who had been invited to lecture at Harvard Medical School about his innovative psychiatric treatments, the kind of man who had published papers celebrating his miraculous cure rates and his revolutionary therapeutic approaches. "I found the basement," Marcus said, and he watched Dr. Ashford's face carefully to see if there would be any reaction, any surprise, any indication that he had not known exactly what was in those jars. Dr. Ashford set down his pen slowly. He did not look up from his papers. He continued reading for perhaps 30 seconds, and in that silence, Marcus realized that the doctor had known, had always known, had designed the entire hospital around the basement, had built a sanctuary for healing specifically to have access to the broken and desperate souls who would be brought to him seeking cure, and who would instead become part of his collection. "That basement is not relevant to the hospital's operations," Dr. Ashford said, and his voice was calm, as if he were discussing a minor administrative matter, rather than the existence of a chamber containing dozens of human remains. "What happens in that basement is my concern. What happens in the wards above is your concern, Father. I suggest you remember your role and stay in your lane." Marcus left St. Augustine's that day and never returned. He went directly to the Boston Police. He went to the Hospital Board of Directors. He went to the Massachusetts Medical Board. And he discovered, over the course of the next weeks, that reporting a monster is not the same as stopping a monster. That institutions exist specifically to protect themselves and other institutions like them. That the psychiatric establishment would not easily accept that one of its own, a celebrated pioneer in psychiatric medicine, was a serial killer hiding behind the authority of his position. To understand how Dr. Samuel Ashford had managed to operate a killing factory inside a hospital for 43 years without detection, one must first understand what Samuel Ashford was. He was not a madman in the popular sense. He did not display obvious signs of psychosis or derangement. He was intelligent, educated, charming when he chose to be, and deeply committed to the study of mental illness. He had earned his medical degree from Johns Hopkins University in 1908. He had studied under some of the most respected psychiatrists of the era, and he had published work on psychiatric methodology that was praised for its innovation and insights. But Samuel Ashford had a fundamental problem that no amount of education or prestige could cure. He did not view human beings as possessing inherent value. To him, other people were objects to be studied, to be used, to be disposed of when they were no longer useful. His patients, particularly his most vulnerable patients, those with severe mental illnesses that made them dependent on the hospital for survival, were not people to be healed. They were raw material for experimentation. What separated Ashford from other cruel physicians who had existed throughout history was his particular genius for systematization. Ashford did not simply harm patients in fits of rage or malice. He had constructed a theoretical framework that justified his actions. He had developed what he called elimination therapy, a treatment methodology based on the concept that certain mental illnesses were so severe that they could not be treated, and that such patients were suffering pointlessly. that the humane course of action was to end their suffering by ending their lives. That to do so was not murder, but mercy. The hospital board had never questioned this framework because Ashford had presented it with sufficient academic rigor that it seemed like a legitimate psychiatric innovation. He had published papers on the subject under pseudonyms in obscure medical journals. He had carefully documented his elimination therapy outcomes in a way that made it seem like he was simply reporting on his treatment results. He had surrounded himself with subordinate physicians and nurses who were either terrified of him or complicit in his crimes, or, in many cases, simply did not want to acknowledge what they suspected was happening beneath the hospital's beautiful stone facade. Ashford had carefully selected the hospital's location on a hillside 40 miles outside Boston, specifically because it was isolated enough that he could conduct his operations without excessive scrutiny, but close enough to the city that he could attract referrals from Boston's psychiatric establishment. He had designed the building himself, incorporating features that no standard hospital required: the sealed basement, the crematorium, the chemical storage rooms, the isolation cells that were officially listed as therapeutic chambers, but which were actually designed to torture information out of patients, or simply to contain them until they were ready for elimination. And he had been extraordinarily careful about which patients to select for his elimination therapy. He chose the most vulnerable, those with no family, no external advocates, no one who would come looking for them. He chose patients whose mental illnesses made them easiest to dismiss. A schizophrenic patient who disappeared? Easy to assume they had wandered off and gotten lost. A patient with severe depression admitted to the hospital and then reported discharged. Easy to assume they had simply moved to another facility. Ashford maintained meticulous records that showed each victim being officially admitted and then officially discharged on a specific date, creating a paperwork cover that made disappearance seem like routine hospital business. The first victim that records would eventually document was a woman named Catherine Summers, admitted to St. Augustine's in July 1911. Catherine was 23 years old, from a poor family in Dorchester, Massachusetts. She had been diagnosed with what was then called dementia praecox, what modern medicine would recognize as schizophrenia. She had been hearing voices, experiencing delusions, unable to maintain employment or function in normal society. Her family, desperate for help, had admitted her to St. Augustine's after reading about Dr. Ashford's miraculous cure rates in a newspaper article. Catherine's file documented that she was admitted on July 15, 1911, and discharged on August 3, 1911, after completing her treatment course. The discharge note suggested she had recovered sufficiently to resume normal life. But Catherine Summers never appeared in Boston after her discharge. Her family never heard from her. The address listed as her discharge destination, her parents' home in Dorchester, showed no record of her ever arriving. And the only remaining evidence that Catherine Summers had ever existed was the jar in Dr. Ashford's basement, labeled Patient 1, July 1911, discharged, containing the dissolving remains of what had been a human being. There would be 46 more jars after Catherine, and then another 147 whose remains had been disposed of more completely in the crematorium. 200 people over 43 years, not randomly selected, not killed in fits of rage, systematically murdered as part of what Ashford had conceptualized as a program of psychiatric innovation. When Father Marcus Whitmore reported his discovery to the Boston Police Department on November 18, 1954, the initial response was skepticism. Police detectives found it difficult to believe that a prestigious psychiatric hospital had been operating as a killing facility under the noses of the medical establishment. They found it difficult to believe that a celebrated physician had been systematically murdering patients for decades. They found it difficult to believe, in short, that the respectable world they inhabited could contain such horrors. But Marcus was persistent. He was a priest, which gave him credibility that a layperson might have lacked. He had witnesses, other hospital staff members who, once the investigation began, admitted they had suspected something was wrong, but had rationalized it away or feared retaliation from Dr. Ashford. He had physical evidence, the jars, the remains, the meticulous records in Ashford's own handwriting documenting the dissolution process. The investigation that followed revealed that St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital was not an isolated case of institutional horror. It was a symptom of a larger systematic failure. The psychiatric establishment had been so committed to the idea of Ashford as an innovator, so invested in his theoretical framework and his published work, that they had refused to see the evidence of his crimes even when it was presented to them. Medical journals that had published his papers under pseudonyms refused to acknowledge the author. Psychiatric conferences that had celebrated his methodologies refused to connect them to the crimes. The system had protected itself with the same efficiency that Ashford had used to dispose of his victims. Dr. Samuel Ashford was arrested on November 22, 1954, 4 days after Father Marcus made his initial report. He was 68 years old at the time of his arrest, old enough that his lifetime of crimes had seemed to be reaching a natural conclusion, old enough that he had perhaps become complacent, had perhaps stopped updating his documentation practices to the standards of modern record-keeping, had perhaps failed to notice that the young priest who had been the hospital chaplain for 3 years had been watching, had been documenting, had been preparing to expose him. The trial of Dr. Samuel Ashford lasted 6 weeks in the spring of 1955. It became the most sensational criminal trial of the decade, rivaling even the Leopold and Loeb case in its capacity to fascinate and horrify the public. A respected physician, a prestigious hospital, a psychiatric establishment that had failed to notice systematic murder, a basement filled with human remains. The trial was covered by every major newspaper in America. Journalists descended on Boston. Psychiatrists who had celebrated Ashford's work were called to testify about how they had failed to notice the fundamental evil of what he was doing. And Dr. Samuel Ashford sat in the courtroom and denied nothing. He answered questions about his crimes with the same clinical precision he had used to document them. He explained his theoretical framework of elimination therapy with the same academic rigor he would have used in a medical lecture. He showed no remorse. He displayed no emotion. He seemed to every observer in the courtroom to be exactly what he was, a man who did not possess the capacity for human empathy, a man for whom other people were simply objects to be studied and disposed of, a man who had built his entire life around the systematic exploitation of his position and the vulnerabilities of those placed under his care. Ashford was convicted of 47 counts of murder, 1 for each body found in the basement. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1963 at age 77, never expressing any remorse for his crimes, never explaining his motivations beyond the dry clinical framework of his elimination therapy theory. The closure of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital in December 1954 marked the end of an era in American psychiatric care. The hospital building itself was demolished in 1957. The stone blocks that had been meant to soothe disturbed minds were pulverized and scattered. The basement where 47 jars had held human remains was sealed and covered over with concrete. But the hospital's legacy, the questions it raised about institutional accountability, about how monsters can hide inside systems designed to protect the vulnerable, about how the medical establishment protects its own even in the face of overwhelming evidence of crime, those questions would persist long after the building was gone. Father Marcus Whitmore lived another 32 years after his discovery in that basement. He left the priesthood in 1956, unable to reconcile his faith with the revelation that God's house, his role as a chaplain in that hospital, had been a cover for systematic murder. He became a journalist, documenting cases of institutional abuse and psychiatric negligence. He wrote a book about his experience at St. Augustine's titled The Sanctuary, which became a bestseller and sparked widespread reforms in psychiatric hospital oversight and accountability. But Marcus never fully recovered from what he had seen in that basement. The image of those jars, each one labeled with a patient number and a discharge date that was actually a death date, remained with him until his own death in 1986. He had nightmares about Catherine Summers, the first victim, the woman whose dissolving remains he had held in his hands while understanding that she had been one of 200. He had developed a conviction that he should have noticed earlier, should have suspected, should have investigated sooner. He carried the guilt of complicity, even though complicity requires knowledge, and he had not possessed knowledge until that November day when he had descended into the basement and discovered the evidence of Ashford's systematic killing. The case of Dr. Samuel Ashford in St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital raised fundamental questions about psychiatric medicine that would not be resolved for decades. It exposed the failures of the psychiatric establishment to police itself, to investigate suspicious mortality rates, to notice when one of its celebrated members might be committing crimes. It demonstrated how the vulnerability of psychiatric patients, their isolation, their stigma, their dependence on the institutions meant to help them, made them ideal victims for predators hiding inside positions of authority and trust. Modern psychiatric ethics traces much of its framework back to the revelations of the St. Augustine's case. The requirement for independent oversight of psychiatric hospitals, the mandate to report suspicious mortality rates, the prohibition on physicians having complete autonomy over decisions about patient care without external review. All of these safeguards emerged, at least in part, as direct responses to how completely St. Augustine's had failed its patients. And yet the case also raised a darker question, one that was never fully answered. How many other Ashfords were operating at the edges of the psychiatric system? How many other hospitals had death rates that were conveniently explained away? How many other vulnerable patients disappeared into institutions and never emerged? The investigation into Ashford revealed patterns at other hospitals, suspicious mortality rates, records that didn't quite add up, patients discharged to addresses that didn't exist. But the psychiatric establishment resisted thorough investigation, resisted the notion that their system was systematically failing its most vulnerable patients. The jars from St. Augustine's basement were eventually destroyed. The remains were cremated with proper ceremony and buried in an unmarked grave in Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery. But photographs of the jars had been taken by police investigators before they were destroyed. Those photographs exist to this day, evidence of industrial-scale killing conducted inside an institution designed to heal. The investigation into St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital deepened over the course of December 1954 and January 1955. And with each layer of examination, the magnitude of Dr. Ashford's crimes became increasingly apparent. It was not simply 47 documented victims in glass jars. It was approximately 200 people who had entered St. Augustine's seeking treatment and who had disappeared into the institution without ever emerging alive. It was the systematic failure of every institutional mechanism that was supposed to protect vulnerable patients. And it was the revelation of a pattern so perfectly constructed, so methodically executed, that it suggested Ashford had been committing these crimes not in secret, but quite openly, hidden only by the willingness of the psychiatric establishment to look away. The Boston police investigation was led by Detective Thomas Harrigan, a man who would become haunted by the case for the rest of his life. Harrigan was 53 years old in 1954, a veteran detective with experience in financial crimes and fraud, not homicide. But the St. Augustine's case was not a typical murder investigation. The victims were not randomly selected. The murders were not crimes of passion or impulse. They were systematic eliminations conducted by a man with a doctorate and a position of institutional authority, which made them fundamentally different from the street murders Harrigan had investigated in his previous career. Harrigan's first task was determining exactly how many people had been killed. The jars in the basement provided documentation for 47 victims, but those were only the remains that Ashford had preserved. The crematorium in the basement's far chamber, a sophisticated piece of equipment that should never have been part of a hospital, had been used to completely incinerate hundreds of other bodies. Ashford's records, when examined by forensic experts, showed that he had been methodical in his documentation of incineration. Dates, patient names, weight of remains before and after cremation, disposal of ash in various locations throughout the hospital grounds and in the Charles River. Harrigan began the painstaking process of cross-referencing hospital admission records with discharge records. He discovered that the methodology was sickeningly simple. A patient would be admitted with whatever psychiatric diagnosis Ashford deemed appropriate for elimination therapy. That patient would then disappear from the visible hospital operation within days or weeks of admission. The hospital records would show discharge, with notations about the patient's improvement or the completion of their treatment course. But there was no documentation of where the patient went after discharge. No forwarding address where they could be followed up with. No transition period where the patient was eased back into society. They simply ceased to exist in the hospital's records. When Harrigan sent investigators to follow up on discharge addresses, they discovered that in the vast majority of cases, the addresses were either fictional or were addresses that the patient could not possibly have traveled to. A woman with severe schizophrenia, and no resources listed as having been discharged to a farm in rural Vermont that did not exist. a man with paralyzing depression listed as having been discharged to a boarding house in New York, whose proprietor had never heard of him. Ashford had simply invented discharge destinations, had created a paperwork fiction that explained the patient's disappearance without requiring investigation. To truly understand the horror of St. Augustine's, one must understand not just the mechanism of the murders, but the specific lives that were ended. The victims were not statistics in a criminal investigation. They were people, broken, vulnerable, desperate people who had made the mistake of trusting institutions and the individuals who ran them. James Sullivan was 34 years old when he was admitted to St. Augustine's in August 1911, just 1 month after Catherine Summers. James had worked as a school teacher in Boston before experiencing what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. During a depressive episode, he had attempted suicide by throwing himself from a bridge. He had survived the fall with severe injuries, including a broken spine that left him partially paralyzed and in chronic pain. His family, unable to care for him, had admitted him to St. Augustine's, hoping that Dr. Ashford's psychiatric innovations might help him recover emotionally from his trauma and despair. James's hospital file documented that he had been treated for several weeks and then discharged to his family. But James never returned to his family. His sister, who had arranged his admission, inquired after him multiple times and was told by hospital administrators that he had become despondent and had chosen to leave the hospital without official discharge. No investigation was launched. No search was conducted. James Sullivan simply disappeared into the space between the hospital's official records and whatever happened to him in Dr. Ashford's basement. What happened to James Sullivan, according to Ashford's preserved documentation, was that he was judged unsuitable for elimination therapy initially because of his spinal injury. Ashford noted in his records that the pain management complications made him an unsuitable subject. Instead, James was kept alive for approximately 4 months, during which time Ashford conducted experiments on him involving the combination of various psychiatric medications at dosages far exceeding approved levels. These experiments were documented in Ashford's personal journals, which were discovered during the investigation. James experienced seizures, organ dysfunction, cardiac arrhythmias. When he finally died, on December 11, 1911, from what Ashford's records described as complications of experimental pharmaceutical therapy, his body was immediately cremated, and the cremation was documented in the hospital's maintenance records as disposal of medical waste. Margaret Chen, admitted October 1912. Margaret Chen was 19 years old when she was admitted to St. Augustine's, referred by the Boston Lunatic Asylum, where she had been diagnosed with severe catatonia. Margaret was the daughter of Chinese immigrants, which made her triply vulnerable. Marginalized by her immigrant status, victimized by the racism of early 20th century America, and isolated by her psychiatric condition in a society that had no vocabulary for understanding mental illness, except through the lens of moral failure or permanent deterioration. Margaret's admission file contained notes by Dr. Ashford, suggesting that he viewed her as an ideal candidate for his elimination therapy. She had no family who would aggressively pursue inquiries after her. She had no social connections that would lead to questions about her disappearance. She was isolated, vulnerable, and disposable in the eyes of the physician who was supposed to be healing her. Margaret was kept alive at St. Augustine's for 6 weeks. During that time, Ashford's records documented that she was subjected to what he called sensory deprivation therapy, which involved keeping her in complete darkness and silence for extended periods. The purpose of this treatment, according to Ashford's notes, was to cleanse the consciousness of accumulated delusions. What actually happened was that Margaret developed severe dehydration, weight loss, and what would now be recognized as acute psychosis from the sensory deprivation. When she could no longer be kept alive through force feeding and minimal life support, Ashford discontinued all care, and Margaret died on November 30th, 1912. Her body was cremated, and the record was filed under hospital maintenance logs. Thomas Rivera was 41 years old when he was admitted to St. Augustine's in March 1925. Thomas had been a factory worker in Springfield, Massachusetts, until a workplace accident had crushed his left hand. The subsequent surgical intervention had been unsuccessful, and the hand had been amputated. Thomas, unable to work with one hand, had become increasingly depressed. His wife, exhausted by his refusal to engage in recovery, had admitted him to St. Augustine's after reading about Dr. Ashford's miraculous cure rates. Thomas's file showed that he had been in the hospital for 3 days before being transferred to what the hospital records listed as physical rehabilitation ward. No such ward existed. What actually occurred was that Thomas was taken to the basement, where Ashford examined him and determined that his amputation made him unsuitable for systematic cremation. The logistics of the crematorium were apparently complicated by extremities that had already been removed. Instead, Thomas was subjected to what Ashford's records described as occupational therapy, which involved forcing the one-handed patient to perform increasingly difficult physical tasks until his body simply could not sustain the stress. Thomas died on the 14th day of his hospitalization, ostensibly from complications of depression and cardiac episodes. His body was dissolved in the chemical vats, and his remains ended up in one of the jars that Father Marcus would discover 29 years later. As Detective Harrigan dug deeper into Ashford's records, he began to discern the systematic nature of the killing. It was not haphazard. It was not reactive. It was a carefully constructed process, with specific stages that Ashford had refined over his 4 decades of operation at St. Augustine's. Ashford had developed specific criteria for victim selection. The ideal candidate for elimination therapy, according to his published papers and his personal notes, had the following characteristics: severe mental illness that was considered incurable under the psychiatric paradigm of the era, social isolation with no family members who would aggressively pursue inquiries, low social status that meant their disappearance would not trigger widespread investigation, economic desperation that made institutional commitment more likely to be permanent, and what Ashford called treatment resistance, meaning the patient showed no signs of improvement under conventional psychiatric interventions. The hospital's admission process was designed to feed Ashford an endless supply of suitable victims. He had cultivated relationships with other psychiatric institutions, accepting referrals of patients who were considered treatment failures at other hospitals. He had developed referral networks with poorhouses, almshouses, and other institutions for the indigent. He had even established relationships with police departments, who sometimes referred individuals arrested for public intoxication or vagrancy to St. Augustine's, rather than prosecuting them criminally. Once a patient had been selected, they were isolated from the main hospital population. This was ostensibly for therapeutic purposes. Ashford's published papers described isolation as an important component of his psychiatric methodology. What it actually accomplished was removing the patient from any potential witnesses who might notice that the patient never left the isolation ward. It removed opportunities for the patient to communicate with other staff members who might become suspicious. It placed the patient entirely under Ashford's control. During the isolation period, the patient would be subjected to various forms of deprivation or stress. Sometimes this took the form of forced medication at dangerous dosages. Sometimes it involved sensory deprivation. Sometimes it involved physical stress or forced labor. The specific methodology varied based on Ashford's interests in a particular case, but the purpose was always the same: to document the patient's deterioration as evidence that they were unsuitable for recovery and therefore appropriate candidates for elimination. Once a patient's deterioration had been documented sufficiently, Ashford would make a determination that the patient was no longer suitable for continued care and that humane termination was appropriate. The specific methodology of termination varied. Some patients were given overdoses of pharmaceutical agents. Some were denied food and water until they died of dehydration. Some were subjected to physical stress until their bodies simply ceased functioning. Some were left untreated through infections that Ashford deliberately introduced and then refused to treat. The documentation of the elimination process was where Ashford's pathological precision became most apparent. He recorded the time of death. He weighed the body. He documented the condition of the remains. He cataloged the cremation or chemical dissolution process. He filed all of this information in meticulous records that he apparently never believed would be examined by anyone outside his control. The disposal process was the final stage, and it was where Ashford's genius for systematic evil became most apparent. He had constructed the crematorium to be a sophisticated piece of equipment capable of reducing human remains to ash within a few hours. He had procured chemical vats of sufficient size to dissolve even large bodies within days. He had established disposal protocols for the ash and chemical residue that made it nearly impossible to prove that any specific person had been disposed of. Some remains were cremated and scattered on the hospital grounds. Some were mixed with hospital waste and disposed of in the town's sanitary landfill. Some were placed in weighted containers and dumped in the Charles River at night. Some, like the 47 victims in jars, were preserved specifically for Ashford's own purposes, perhaps as trophies or as documentation of his work. The turning point in the investigation came when forensic experts examined Ashford's personal journals, which had been discovered hidden in a wall safe in his office. These journals contained Ashford's own narrative of his murders, written in a clinical and precise tone that suggested he viewed his crimes as legitimate medical practice rather than homicide. The journals documented approximately 187 specific cases where Ashford had determined that patients were suitable candidates for elimination therapy, and approximately 156 of these cases had resulted in documented death. But the most disturbing aspect of the journals was not the documentation of murders. It was Ashford's philosophical justification for them. Ashford wrote at length about what he called therapeutic mercy. He argued that certain mental illnesses were so severe that they were essentially fatal conditions, that patients with these illnesses were suffering without hope of recovery, and that continuing to subject them to the trauma of their existence was cruel. That the humane course of action was to end that suffering by ending the patient's life. That this was not murder but euthanasia, and that it should be an accepted part of psychiatric practice. These journals revealed that Ashford had genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate medical practice. He had not hidden his crimes because he knew they were wrong. He had hidden them because he believed that the psychiatric establishment was too conservative, too bound by outdated ethical constraints, to understand the necessity of what he was doing. He had hidden them because he knew that society at large would not accept his innovations, even though he believed those innovations represented the future of psychiatric medicine. Detective Harrigan brought the journals to Dr. Philip Whitmore, a leading psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School who had been consulting on the investigation. Dr. Whitmore's response was to sit in silence for several minutes while he read passages from Ashford's journals, and then to say, "This is exactly what I have been afraid of. Not that Ashford was a psychopath, but that he genuinely believed this was medicine." The investigation uncovered evidence that Ashford had corresponded with other psychiatrists about his methodology. Some of these correspondences suggested interest from other physicians. One letter from a physician at a psychiatric hospital in New York asked for detailed information about Ashford's elimination therapy techniques. Another letter from a psychiatrist in Pennsylvania requested copies of Ashford's published papers on the subject. Whether any of these other physicians actually attempted to implement Ashford's methodology was never definitively established, but the investigation suggested that Ashford's crimes were not unique to St. Augustine's. They were perhaps the most systematically implemented and thoroughly documented. But the underlying framework might have been present in other institutions as well. When Dr. Samuel Ashford was arrested on November 22, 1954, he was taken into police custody with the calm acceptance of a man who believed he had done nothing wrong. His response to the arrest was not panic or denial or attempts to construct an alibi. His response was to ask his lawyer what specific charges he was being brought in for, and then, when informed that he was being charged with multiple counts of murder, to ask whether this was in reference to his documentation of therapeutic mercy at St. Augustine's. The interrogation of Dr. Ashford, conducted by Detective Harrigan over the course of 3 days in December 1954, revealed a man who appeared to have absolutely no capacity for empathy or recognition of the humanity of his victims. When Harrigan presented him with the cases of specific patients who had been murdered, Ashford's response was to discuss them in clinical terms, as if they were interesting medical cases rather than human beings whose lives had been ended under his care. Harrigan: Dr. Ashford, Catherine Summers was admitted to your hospital with schizophrenia. She was 23 years old. According to your own records, she died in your basement 3 weeks after admission. How do you explain her death? Ashford: Ms. Summers presented with severe treatment-resistant schizophrenia. Her prognosis was extremely poor. She would have spent the remainder of her life in a state of severe psychiatric deterioration, unable to function in normal society, unable to experience the kind of recovery that would make her existence meaningful. I determined that the most humane course of action was to end her suffering. Harrigan: You murdered her. Ashford: I provided her with therapeutic mercy. There is a profound distinction. This pattern repeated throughout the interrogation. Ashford did not deny his crimes. He offered no alternative explanation for the deaths or the disappearances. He simply maintained that what he had done was legitimate medical practice, that he had acted in the best interests of his patients, and that the psychiatric establishment's ethical constraints were outdated and harmful. Most disturbing to Harrigan was that Ashford appeared to believe this entirely. There was no performance, no attempt to manipulate. Ashford seemed genuinely convinced that he was a physician who had developed an innovative treatment that the conservative medical establishment had been too fearful to adopt. That Harrigan, a police detective, was unable to understand the medical necessity of what he had done because Harrigan lacked the training and expertise to recognize the validity of therapeutic mercy. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Ashford's crimes had been possible not simply because of his personal evil, but because of systematic failures in institutional oversight and accountability. The psychiatric establishment had created an environment in which a physician with Ashford's background and credentials could operate with almost complete autonomy, protected by the assumption that physicians act in their patients' best interests. The hospital board of directors, when questioned by investigators, admitted that they had never conducted any independent verification of Ashford's mortality statistics. They had simply accepted his claim that St. Augustine's had an extraordinarily low mortality rate, lower than any other psychiatric hospital in New England. They had not thought to question why a hospital specializing in treatment of severe mental illness would have virtually no deaths. They had simply been proud that they had hired a physician who appeared to be achieving miraculous outcomes. The medical licensing board that was responsible for overseeing Ashford's credentials admitted that they had never inspected St. Augustine's. They had relied entirely on Ashford's self-reporting of his outcomes and his published papers describing his innovative techniques. They had no process for independently verifying mortality statistics or treatment outcomes. They had no mechanism for investigating suspicious patterns. They had essentially abdicated any responsibility for oversight. Other psychiatric institutions that had sent patients to St. Augustine's admitted that they had never followed up to determine what had actually happened to those patients after admission. When families inquired about outcomes, hospital administrators had simply reported what Ashford had reported, that patients had been treated and discharged, with no information about where they had gone after discharge. No one had thought to verify that the discharge addresses were actually real addresses, or that the patients could actually be located at those addresses. The police, when confronted with the systematic nature of Ashford's crimes, admitted that they had never investigated the hospital, despite receiving multiple inquiries about missing persons over the years. Some of these inquiries had been from families searching for relatives who had been admitted to St. Augustine's and never heard from again. But because psychiatric patients were already stigmatized and assumed to be unreliable, because families of psychiatric patients were often poor and powerless, because the hospital was staffed by credentialed physicians and run as a legitimate medical institution, the police had simply closed these cases as missing persons, for whom there was no evidence of foul play. The systematic nature of institutional failure meant that Ashford had been protected by the very systems that were supposed to prevent crimes like his from occurring. He had hidden not through deception or violence or coercion, but through reliance on the assumption that he was trustworthy, precisely because he possessed credentials, because he worked within an institution, because the system was designed to protect physicians rather than scrutinize them. The trial of Dr. Samuel Ashford began on March 15, 1955 in Superior Court in Boston. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every standing space occupied, with journalists and spectators and psychiatric professionals forced to stand in the hallways watching the proceedings through open doors. This was not simply a criminal trial. This was a referendum on the psychiatric establishment itself. This was an examination of how the most vulnerable members of society could be systematically murdered by trusted physicians, while the institutions meant to protect them looked away. Dr. Ashford appeared in court each day dressed impeccably in a suit and tie, his silver hair carefully groomed, his expression one of patient resignation. He did not appear to be a monster. He did not display any of the supposed signs of madness or evil that the public expected a serial killer to show. He appeared, in fact, to be a distinguished physician who had been caught in a misunderstanding with the legal system. This appearance was perhaps more disturbing than if he had appeared visibly deranged, because it suggested that monsters could look exactly like anyone else, could walk through society with complete normalcy, could hide in plain sight behind credentials and institutions, and the simple fact that most people prefer to believe in the trustworthiness of authority. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Margaret Sullivan, one of the few female prosecutors in Boston in 1955, and a woman whose career would be defined by this case. Sullivan had structured her prosecution carefully to make the case accessible to a jury that had no medical expertise. She was not going to ask them to evaluate whether Ashford's methodology represented legitimate psychiatric innovation. She was going to show them that 47 people had entered St. Augustine's hospital alive and had left the hospital dead, and that Ashford was the person responsible for killing them. Sullivan's first witness was Detective Harrigan, who presented the timeline of the investigation, the discovery of the jars in the basement, the documentation of the disposal process. Harrigan's testimony established the physical evidence and the documentation that Ashford himself had created, proving that patients had been systematically murdered. Sullivan's second phase of witnesses consisted of victims' families. This was the section of the trial that would become the most haunting in the coverage and memory of the case. Family members who had admitted loved ones to St. Augustine's Hospital with hope, and who had later learned that those loved ones had been murdered by the physician who was supposed to be helping them. Each family member who testified provided a context that made the victims human, rather than simply statistical evidence of Ashford's crimes. Catherine Summers's mother, Eleanor Summers, testified about admitting her daughter to the hospital at age 23. Eleanor described Catherine's schizophrenia, the confusion, the loss of herself, the desperate hope that Dr. Ashford could help her daughter recover. Eleanor described waiting for news, for letters, for any indication that Catherine was improving. She described the moment when the hospital had informed her that Catherine had been discharged, and the subsequent years of searching for her daughter, of never finding her, of living in a state of uncertainty about what had happened to her only child. Eleanor was 71 years old when she testified, and her grief at learning that Catherine had been murdered was so raw and immediate that several spectators wept in the courtroom. Thomas Rivera's wife, Maria Rivera, testified about admitting her husband to the hospital after his amputation and depression. Maria described her husband's pain, his despair, her desperate hope that the hospital would help him recover. She described the days when Thomas was at St. Augustine's, her anticipation of his recovery, her plans for how they would rebuild their lives after he was treated. She described the hospital's notification that Thomas had died from cardiac complications. She described her shock at learning, 30 years later, that Thomas had actually been deliberately starved to death as part of Ashford's elimination therapy. Maria, who had believed herself to be a widow, resulting from her husband's natural death, learned that she was actually the widow of a murder victim. This pattern repeated for each family member who testified. The prosecution was systematically humanizing the victims, showing the jury that these were not abstractions or statistics, but actual people who had been loved, who had been missed, who had had families who grieved their loss. The prosecution was asking the jury to imagine how they would feel if they had admitted a loved one to a hospital seeking help, and that loved one had been murdered by the physician who was supposed to be healing them. Ashford's defense strategy was unusual and, in retrospect, probably counterproductive. Rather than attempting to deny the crimes or to construct an alternative explanation for the deaths, Ashford's legal team essentially argued that what Ashford had done was not actually murder because it constituted legitimate medical practice. That Ashford had been exercising his medical judgment in determining that certain patients were unsuitable for continued treatment, and that terminating their lives was the appropriate medical intervention. This strategy required Ashford himself to testify, which he did with remarkable composure. Ashford took the stand and described his methodology in clinical detail. He explained his theory of elimination therapy, his criteria for determining which patients were suitable for termination, his documentation process. He described the specific cases without any apparent recognition that he was describing the murders of human beings. To Ashford, he was discussing medical cases. The fact that those cases had resulted in death was, to him, simply a clinical outcome to be documented and analyzed. The prosecution's cross-examination of Ashford was devastating. Ada Sullivan asked Ashford specific questions about specific victims. Dr. Ashford, Catherine Summers was admitted to your hospital with schizophrenia. Is that correct? Yes. She was a 23-year-old patient with severe psychiatric illness. And you determined that she was unsuitable for recovery. Is that correct? That is my assessment. And so you decided to kill her. Is that correct? I determined that terminating her condition through therapeutic mercy was the appropriate medical intervention. You killed her. You put her body in a chemical solution and dissolved her remains. Isn't that correct? I used appropriate disposal methodology for medical waste. Dr. Ashford, Catherine Summers was not medical waste. Catherine Summers was a human being. A person. A woman with a family who loved her. Do you understand that? Ashford paused, and in that pause, something became very clear to everyone in the courtroom. Ashford did not understand that. Ashford did not possess the capacity to understand that Catherine Summers was a person, rather than a case study. Ashford was not simply a criminal attempting to evade responsibility. Ashford was an individual who lacked some fundamental human capacity for empathy, who could view other people only as objects to be studied and disposed of, who had built his entire life and career around this fundamental disconnection from human feeling. The cross-examination continued through multiple victims. Each victim was presented, each murder was described, each act of disposal was documented. And through it all, Ashford maintained his calm clinical demeanor, his insistence that he had acted appropriately within his professional judgment, his complete inability or refusal to acknowledge that what he had done was anything other than medical practice. The psychiatric testimony in the trial became a referendum on the psychiatric profession itself. Expert witnesses from Harvard Medical School, from Johns Hopkins, from other leading psychiatric institutions, testified about whether Ashford's methodology could be considered legitimate psychiatric practice. The consensus was clear. It could not. Even the most progressive psychiatrists of the era, even those who acknowledged that some psychiatric conditions were treatment-resistant and that some patients had poor prognoses, testified that there was no legitimate psychiatric basis for killing patients. That psychiatric ethics, even in 1955, prohibited physicians from terminating the lives of patients under their care. That what Ashford had done violated every principle of medical ethics and professional responsibility. But the testimony also revealed something darker and more troubling. That many of Ashford's theoretical framework was not unique to him. That in the early 20th century, there had been a movement in psychiatric circles, never formally organized but clearly present, toward what was euphemistically called therapeutic elimination, or negative selection. That some of the most respected psychiatric institutions in America had had higher mortality rates than could be explained by natural causes. That there were patterns suggesting that Ashford's methodology, while perhaps more systematic and better documented than others, was not entirely unique. One of the most powerful pieces of expert testimony came from Dr. Philip Whitmore, the Harvard psychiatrist who had been consulting with the investigation. Dr. Whitmore testified that he had reviewed Ashford's published papers and that they had been praised in psychiatric circles precisely because they appeared to represent a legitimate innovation in psychiatric practice. That the psychiatric establishment had been so eager to believe in Ashford's claims of miraculous cure rates that it had failed to notice the obvious logical problem. That a hospital with Ashford's reported mortality rate was literally impossible unless he was deliberately killing patients. The psychiatric establishment, Dr. Whitmore testified, failed catastrophically to police itself. We celebrated Dr. Ashford's work without verifying his claims. We praised his innovations without conducting independent investigation. We created an environment in which a physician with Ashford's pathology could operate with virtual impunity. That failure is as much a part of this crime as Dr. Ashford's actions themselves. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on 47 counts of murder, one for each body found in the basement jars. There was no conviction for the additional 150 victims whose remains had been cremated, because there was insufficient individual evidence to prove the specific cause of death in those cases. But the 47 convictions were sufficient. Dr. Samuel Ashford was sentenced to life imprisonment on April 23, 1955. He was 68 years old at the time of sentencing. He would serve 9 years of that sentence before dying in prison in 1963 at the age of 77. During sentencing, the judge addressed Ashford directly, noting that this was a case of unprecedented evil, a physician who had used his position of trust to systematically murder vulnerable patients over more than 4 decades. The judge noted that the only reason Ashford's crimes had been discovered was through the moral courage of Father Marcus Whitmore, who had chosen to report what he had found rather than remaining silent to protect the institution. The judge noted that the case represented a fundamental failure of institutional accountability and professional oversight that would require systematic reform. But what was perhaps most striking about the sentencing was Ashford's response. He showed no remorse. He displayed no emotion. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Ashford simply stated, I believe that future psychiatric practice will vindicate my methodology. The system that is condemning me today will eventually recognize that I was ahead of my time. History will judge me more favorably than this court has done. This statement, made by a man who had just been convicted of murdering 47 people, seemed to embody the most disturbing aspect of the case. That Ashford did not believe he was guilty of murder, that he believed he had been conducting legitimate medical practice, that he was confident that history would eventually vindicate him, that he possessed no capacity for remorse or recognition of the wrongness of his actions. The revelation of Ashford's crimes and the systematic failures that had enabled them sparked a wave of reforms in psychiatric practice and institutional oversight that would reshape American psychiatry for the remainder of the 20th century. The case became a touchstone for discussions of medical ethics, institutional accountability, and the vulnerability of psychiatric patients. The most immediate result of the trial was the implementation of mandatory independent oversight of psychiatric hospitals. Medical licensing boards established procedures for conducting unannounced inspections of psychiatric facilities. States began requiring regular reporting of patient mortality statistics. Psychiatric hospitals were required to maintain detailed records of patient admissions, discharges, and deaths, with these records subject to independent audit. The Ashford case also sparked a broader examination of psychiatric practice in other institutions. Investigators began examining hospital records for patterns that might suggest similar crimes. A hospital in New York was found to have unusually high mortality rates, and a physician there was found to have been conducting similar elimination therapy programs. A hospital in Pennsylvania was discovered to have had patterns of suspicious deaths and disappearances. While none of the other cases produced conviction records as comprehensive as Ashford's, they suggested that the problem was more widespread than a single hospital and a single physician. The case also led to reforms in psychiatric medicine itself. The concept of therapeutic mercy or elimination therapy was thoroughly discredited, and psychiatric ethics boards established clear prohibitions on any physician involvement in ending the lives of patients. While debates about euthanasia and physician-assisted death would continue throughout the remainder of the 20th century, the notion that such decisions could be made unilaterally by a physician within an institutional setting was thoroughly rejected. Father Marcus Whitmore's decision to report the crimes, despite his role as hospital chaplain, and despite the institutional pressures against him, became a model for institutional whistleblowers. His courage in refusing to remain silent and in pursuing accountability through external authorities became a standard against which other whistleblowers would be measured. 60 years after Dr. Ashford's arrest, St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital remains one of the most studied cases in the history of institutional failure and serial homicide. The case is taught in medical schools as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the necessity of institutional oversight. It is studied in criminology programs as an example of serial murder conducted within institutional contexts. It is examined in psychiatric ethics courses as a case study in how the medical profession can fail its most vulnerable patients. The site where St. Augustine stood is now empty, marked only by a granite monument that lists the names of the victims. Over 100 names are carved into the stone, not the full 200 that some historians believe died at Ashford's hands, but the names of those whose deaths have been sufficiently documented to warrant recognition. Visitors to the site report a sense of profound sadness, of grief unresolved, of a place where institutional failure had allowed evil to flourish for decades. Some of the victims' relatives have maintained the memorial. Catherine Summers's great-great-granddaughter, Emily Summers, has worked for years to document her ancestor's story, and to ensure that Catherine is remembered not as a statistic in a crime case, but as a real person who had a family that loved her and who deserved to live. Emily has created a website dedicated to the victims of St. Augustine's, compiling what information exists about each person, creating a digital memorial that ensures they are not forgotten. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Ashford case is what it revealed about institutional vulnerability. The systems that were supposed to protect psychiatric patients, the medical licensing boards, the hospital oversight, the professional peer review, had all failed catastrophically. And the reason they failed was not because they were weak or inadequately designed, but because they were designed to operate on the assumption that authority could be trusted, that physicians would police themselves, that institutions could be counted on to protect vulnerable populations. The Ashford case demonstrated that this assumption was fundamentally flawed. That institutions often protect themselves and other institutions rather than protecting the vulnerable. That professionals often fail to police their own, preferring to maintain the reputation of their profession over protecting the public. That authority cannot simply be trusted without independent oversight and accountability mechanisms. This lesson has been reinforced repeatedly over the past 60 years. Other cases have emerged. Cases of institutional abuse, cases of serial murder within medical settings, cases of institutional failure enabling predators. Each case has reinforced the lesson that St. Augustine's taught, that vigilance is necessary, that oversight is required, that the vulnerability of patients in institutional settings makes them targets for abuse, unless those settings are monitored and held accountable. In 2015, 60 years after Ashford's arrest, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen began investigating the Ashford case as part of a project examining serial murder within institutional contexts. Sarah interviewed surviving family members of victims. She examined original trial records. She visited the site where St. Augustine's had stood. In the course of her investigation, Sarah discovered something that had been largely forgotten. Dr. Ashford had corresponded extensively with other psychiatrists about his methodology. Many of these correspondences had been preserved in medical archives, and several of them suggested that Ashford's ideas had not been entirely unique, that other physicians, in other institutions, had been experimenting with similar approaches to patient termination. Sarah's research suggested that the actual number of people who had been killed by psychiatrists in the United States in the early 20th century might be significantly higher than Ashford's case alone would suggest. That perhaps dozens of physicians, in institutions across the country, had been conducting similar programs of elimination therapy. That the Ashford case was not an aberration, but rather the most thoroughly documented example of a pattern that had been more widespread than the medical establishment had ever acknowledged. This research has sparked a broader re-examination of institutional records from psychiatric hospitals in the early 20th century. Medical historians are systematically examining mortality records from hospitals across the United States, looking for patterns that might suggest institutional killing. Some historians believe that as many as 10,000, 15,000 people may have been killed by physicians in psychiatric institutions during the first half of the 20th century, a number that dwarfs Ashford's personally documented murders. But unlike the Holocaust, which has been thoroughly documented and integrated into historical consciousness, these psychiatric murders have remained largely invisible. Most people have never heard of St. Augustine's. Most people have never heard of Dr. Samuel Ashford. The crimes remain relatively unknown despite their scale and horror. Perhaps because the victims were psychiatric patients, already marginalized and stigmatized. Perhaps because the crimes were conducted by respected physicians within legitimate institutions. Perhaps because society prefers to believe that such systemic evil cannot occur within systems it trusts. What remains today, more than 60 years after Ashford's arrest, is a question that society has never adequately answered. How do we protect the vulnerable from predators hiding within positions of authority and trust? How do we maintain oversight and accountability without creating paranoia and distrust of all institutions? How do we learn from the catastrophic failure of institutional oversight without swinging to the opposite extreme of assuming that all authority is inherently corrupt? The Ashford case provides no easy answers to these questions. It demonstrates that institutional oversight is necessary, but it also demonstrates that oversight can fail. It demonstrates that professional peer review is important, but it also demonstrates that professionals often fail to police their own. It demonstrates that vulnerable populations are at particular risk of exploitation, but it also demonstrates that even relatively successful identification and prosecution of such exploitation leaves the underlying vulnerabilities unresolved. Father Marcus Whitmore died in 1986 at the age of 78. He had spent the last 30 years of his life trying to expose institutional abuse in psychiatric care and trying to create mechanisms for protecting vulnerable patients. His legacy is one of moral courage, the courage to report institutional evil despite pressures to remain silent, despite the cost to his own career and peace of mind, despite the knowledge that reporting would not undo the crimes that had already been committed. Detective Thomas Harrigan, who led the investigation into Ashford's crimes, lived until 1988. In his final years, he worked as a consultant on cases involving institutional abuse. He wrote articles and gave lectures about the importance of investigating suspicious patterns in institutional mortality rates. His life work after the Ashford case was dedicated to preventing similar crimes from occurring in other institutions. Dr. Samuel Ashford died in prison in 1963, never expressing remorse, never acknowledging that what he had done was wrong, to the end maintaining that he had been conducting legitimate medical practice and that history would eventually vindicate him. History has not vindicated him. Instead, history has remembered Ashford as one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who murdered approximately 200 people over 4 decades while hiding behind credentials and institutional authority. But what history has not adequately reckoned with is the question of how many other Ashfords there were. How many other physicians in other institutions were conducting similar programs of elimination therapy? How many other victims lie undocumented in unmarked graves or dissolved in forgotten chemical vats, or cremated in basement furnaces that were never intended to exist in healing institutions? The Saints' Sanctuary, which was never actually a sanctuary at all, but rather a killing factory disguised as a hospital, remains a reminder that evil can flourish in plain sight, hidden behind credentials and institutions, and the simple fact that most people prefer to believe in the trustworthiness of authority, and that recognizing that evil requires vigilance, requires willingness to question authority, requires courage to report institutional wrongdoing,